What if the end didn't come with a bang, but with a quiet decision made behind closed doors? What if the most devastating move in modern royal history wasn't shouted from a palace balcony, but whispered in a room where no microphones were allowed? And what if the man at the center of it all didn't lose everything overnight, but watched it disappear piece by piece, privilege by privilege, until there was nothing left to reclaim? That's the question hanging over the British monarchy right now. And it's the question no one inside the palace wants to answer out loud. Because according to multiple converging signals, public, private, legal, and symbolic, the relationship between the crown and Prince Harry may have reached a point of no return. Not a pause, not a rift, not a cooling-off period. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. An ending. Not dramatic, not explosive, final. This is not the story most people think they're watching. Most people believe this is still a family drama, a soap opera of hurt feelings, interviews, and bruised egos. A father and son locked in a stubborn stalemate, waiting for time to soften the edges. But what if time has already run out? What if the decision has already been made, and everything we're seeing now is simply the slow rollout of consequences? Here's the uncomfortable truth. In royal history, endings rarely come with announcements. They come with silence, with access quietly revoked, with names gradually disappearing from documents, ceremonies, and conversations that matter. And when that happens, it doesn't mean reconciliation is coming. It means the system has moved on. To understand why this moment feels different, heavier, colder, more permanent, you have to step back and look at who is now holding the crown. Because this isn't the monarchy of Queen Elizabeth II anymore. This is the monarchy of King Charles III. And King Charles governs differently. For decades, Charles was seen as patient to a fault, emotional, introspective, a man who waited longer than any heir in British history to finally ascend the throne. He watched, he absorbed, he learned what worked, and what nearly broke the institution he would one day inherit. And when he finally became king, he inherited more than ceremony. He inherited instability, a slimmed-down monarchy, a skeptical public, a media environment that punishes hesitation, and a family fracture that refused to heal on its own. Now ask yourself this. What happens when a man who waited his entire life for the crown realizes that the greatest threat to its stability isn't outside the palace, but within the family? That's where this story really begins. Because the narrative most people know, interviews, memoirs, public grievances, is only the surface layer. Beneath it is a quieter, colder process unfolding. A process rooted not in emotion, but in governance. And governance doesn't negotiate with nostalgia. Here's something rarely discussed. Royal titles are not just honorifics. They are legal, constitutional, and symbolic tools. They grant access. They signal legitimacy. They extend the authority of the crown beyond the monarch himself. And when someone who holds those titles repeatedly challenges the institution, not privately, but globally, the monarchy faces a choice. Do nothing and risk appearing weak, or act and risk appearing cruel. For years, the palace chose restraint. But restraint has a shelf life, especially when every concession becomes precedent, especially when silence is interpreted as permission, especially when the future king, not the current one, will inherit the consequences. And that's where the clock started ticking. Because while the public often frames this story as father versus son, the palace sees it differently. They see continuity versus chaos. They see what today's decision will mean in 10, 20, 50 years. They see the long game. And in the long game, sentimentality is a liability. Here's a contradiction most people miss. The more Prince Harry positioned himself as independent from the monarchy, the more complicated his continued connection became. Every title retained, every privilege preserved, every association left intact. It created a paradox. How can someone reject the institution while still benefiting from its authority? How can a monarchy claim modernity while allowing a former working royal to monetize proximity without accountability? These are not emotional questions. They are structural ones. And structures don't bend easily. Inside the palace, the calculus reportedly shifted from, can this be fixed, to something far more sobering. What if it can't? That single question changes everything. Because once you move from repair to containment, the strategy becomes very different. Containment doesn't seek reconciliation. Containment seeks limits. Limits on access, limits on representation, limits on association, and eventually, limits on status. Which brings us to the most chilling aspect of this moment. There has been no dramatic announcement, no sweeping decree broadcast to the world, no televised stripping ceremony. Just subtle shifts, absences, names not mentioned where they once were inevitable, invitations that never arrive, privileges quietly reevaluated. And when you see all of those signals together, they form a pattern, not of punishment, of closure. Ask yourself this. When was the last time the palace publicly defended Prince Harry? When was the last time they corrected a narrative on his behalf? When was the last time his presence felt essential rather than optional? Now compare that to how the institution treats figures it intends to keep within the fold. The difference is stark and intentional, because the monarchy doesn't sever ties impulsively. It phases them out, slowly enough to avoid shock, firmly enough to avoid reversal. This is why insiders keep using the same word behind the scenes. Irreversible, not because of anger, but because of alignment. The crown must align with the future, not the past. And the future of the monarchy does not include ambiguity about loyalty, representation, or authority. That future is being shaped now, quietly, methodically, and perhaps painfully for those caught in its path. Which raises the most haunting question of all. Did Prince Harry see this coming? Or did he believe the door would always remain open, simply because it always had before? History suggests something important. The Queen absorbed shocks, so her successors wouldn't have to. King Charles does not operate under that philosophy. He governs to prevent future crises, not postpone them. And if that means being remembered as the king who drew the line where others refused to, that may be a price he's willing to pay. Because from the palace's perspective, the greatest danger isn't backlash. It's erosion. Erosion of authority. Erosion of clarity. Erosion of the very boundaries that keep the monarchy intact. And once erosion begins, it doesn't stop on its own. That's why this moment feels heavier than any royal feud before it. Because this doesn't feel like a pause. It feels like a conclusion forming in real time. But the most important part of this story, the part that changes how everything else makes sense, hasn't even surfaced yet. Because the silence we're witnessing didn't come first. It came after something else happened. Something private. Something decisive. Something that made the palace realize there was no longer a middle ground. And once that realization set in, everything else followed. The distance. The detachment. The quiet removal from the inner circle. But what exactly triggered that shift? What was the moment when patience finally ran out? And who was in the room when it happened? Because the answer to that question explains everything that came next. And once you see it, there's no unseeing it. Did you notice when the noise stopped? Not the headlines. Not the commentators. The palace. Because before any public sign, before any official freeze-out that people could point to and argue about online, something far more unsettling happened. The internal hum went quiet. No briefings. No gentle corrections. No soft defenses whispered to friendly journalists. Just nothing. And in the world of monarchy, nothing is never nothing. This is the moment most people missed. The moment the palace went silent. And once you understand why that silence mattered, everything else starts to make sense. Here's the uncomfortable question that hangs over it all. What happens when an institution built on continuity decides someone is no longer part of the future? It doesn't shout. It withdraws. Slowly. Deliberately. Without drama. Because drama invites debate. Silence does not. Inside royal circles, silence is the clearest message of all. And it didn't begin with a public event. It began with absence. Calls not returned as quickly as before. Meetings that suddenly couldn't be scheduled. Decisions made without consultation. Small things. Easy to dismiss individually. Devastating when viewed together. This wasn't punishment. It was recalibration. And it happened quietly, behind closed doors, while the public was still arguing about interviews and sound bites. Let's talk about how the monarchy usually handles internal conflict. Historically, when a royal causes discomfort but is still considered part of the institution's future, the response is containment with connection. You keep lines open. You manage optics. You absorb pressure. That's what happened for years. But this time, something shifted. Because containment only works if the person being contained still respects the boundaries. And from the palace's point of view, those boundaries kept getting crossed. Publicly, repeatedly, irreversibly. Now ask yourself this. If the palace truly believed reconciliation was still the goal, would they have gone silent? Or would they have stayed engaged? Silence is not neglect. Silence is a decision. And it coincided with a deeper realization taking hold. This was no longer a crisis to manage. It was a relationship to redefine. Inside the palace, the framing reportedly changed. Not overnight, but unmistakably. The question stopped being, how do we fix this? It became, how do we proceed if this never stops? That single pivot explains everything that followed. Because once you accept that a situation is permanent, not temporary, you stop patching holes. You start redesigning the structure. And that redesign began with one principle. Proceed without him. That phrase, according to multiple insiders over time, is one of the coldest in institutional language. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't argue. It excludes. When proceed without him enters the conversation, it means the system no longer expects participation. It means future planning no longer accounts for presence. And when that happens in a monarchy, the consequences ripple outward fast. Let's be clear about something most people misunderstand. Royal power is not exercised through confrontation. It's exercised through relevance. You don't remove someone by force. You remove them by omission. They're not invited into the room where decisions are shaped. They're not consulted before announcements are finalized. They're not referenced when the future is discussed. And eventually, the world adjusts. This is why silence is more dangerous than outrage. Outrage fades. Silence settles. And this silence coincided with the consolidation of authority under King Charles III in a way the public hadn't fully appreciated yet. Charles had waited decades for the throne. He had watched how hesitation created long-term instability. He had watched how avoiding difficult decisions transferred problems to the next generation. And now, with his reign defined not by longevity but by urgency, he faced a choice. Delay again, or draw a line. The palace knew something else too. The future monarch, Prince William, would inherit whatever unresolved tensions were left behind. And no king wants to hand his successor a ticking time bomb. So the calculus hardened. Not emotionally, strategically. And that's when the silence deepened. One former aide once described this phase as the quiet room. It's the moment when conversations stop being exploratory and start being operational. No more what-ifs. Only how. How do we structure events without his presence? How do we communicate without inviting misinterpretation? How do we protect the institution from future disruption? These questions don't make headlines, but they determine outcomes. Here's a detail most people don't consider. Royal calendars are built months, sometimes years, in advance. When a name stops appearing in early drafts, that's not accidental. It means someone, somewhere, made a decision. And once those drafts are finalized, they don't easily change. This is why silence feels so final. Because it's built into planning. Now think about how this would feel from the outside. From Prince Harry's perspective, there's no single moment you can point to and say, that's when it ended. There's no dramatic phone call. No official letter saying you're out. There's just distance. A sense that you're no longer in the flow of information. That decisions are being made without you. That your relevance is assumed to be diminishing, not debated. That's not exile. That's erasure in progress. And erasure is harder to fight, because there's nothing tangible to protest. What do you argue against? A missed call? A meeting you weren't invited to? A silence no one admits exists? The genius and cruelty of institutional silence is that it leaves no fingerprints. It also leaves no room for reconciliation unless the institution decides it wants one. Which brings us to the emotional contradiction at the heart of this chapter. The palace wasn't acting out of anger. It was acting out of fatigue. Fatigue from constant justification. Fatigue from unpredictable fallout. Fatigue from defending an arrangement that no longer made sense internally. And fatigue is far more dangerous than rage. Because rage can cool. Fatigue seeks resolution. This is where public perception diverges sharply from internal reality. To the outside world, it still looked like an argument. A back and forth. A drama with two sides. Inside, it was being treated as asymmetry. One side had moved on. The other hadn't realized it yet. And when that happens, every interaction feels off balance. Messages feel colder. Responses feel delayed. Engagement feels obligatory, not invested. That's not accidental. That's how systems disengage. There's another layer to this silence that rarely gets discussed. Silence protects the crown. By not responding, the monarchy avoids validating claims. By not engaging, it avoids escalation. By not correcting, it allows narratives to burn themselves out. Or so the logic goes. But silence also signals something else. Finality. Because if you believe a relationship still has a future, you keep the lines open at all costs. You don't go dark. The palace went dark. And when it did, it wasn't just about Harry. It was about redefining the monarchy's center of gravity. A slimmed-down institution cannot afford ambiguity. It cannot carry unresolved contradictions. It cannot allow blurred lines between inside and outside. Clarity became the priority. And clarity demands separation. This is why this chapter matters. Not because of any single action, but because of what stopped happening. No more crisis management. No more soft landings. No more careful balancing acts. Just a quiet, unmistakable shift. Proceed without him. Once that phrase takes hold, everything changes. The tone, the strategy, the endgame. And here's the most unsettling part. By the time the public notices silence, the decision behind it has usually already been made. Silence is not the beginning. It's the aftermath, which means whatever triggered this withdrawal didn't happen in public view. It happened earlier, privately, decisively, and the palace's response tells us one thing with chilling clarity. Whatever crossed that line convinced them there was no longer a middle ground. No compromise that would protect the institution. No reconciliation that wouldn't invite future instability. So the silence settled in, and with it, a new reality. But silence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's always caused by something. A moment, a realization, a breaking point. And that breaking point didn't come from the press. It came from a private line King Charles had resisted crossing for years. Until he didn't. And once that line was crossed, the silence was no longer a tactic. It was policy. What was the line that finally broke it? Because here's the truth most people refuse to confront. This didn't collapse because of one interview. It didn't end because of one book. And it certainly didn't unravel because of social media outrage. Those were symptoms. The real rupture happened somewhere far quieter, in a space where titles still matter, where words are chosen carefully, and where one sentence can change the course of a family and an institution forever. Every monarch has a private boundary they protect at all costs, a line they refuse to cross, no matter how strained things become. For King Charles, that line had always been clear. Do not force a choice between fatherhood and the crown. For years, decades, even, he tried to believe that line would never be tested. That somehow, with time, patience, and distance, things would stabilize on their own. That belief held longer than most people realize. But then came the moment when restraint stopped being protection and started being weakness. And once a king believes his restraint is endangering the institution, everything changes. Here's the question no one inside the palace wanted to ask out loud. What if staying silent wasn't neutral anymore? What if it was actively undermining the crown? That question didn't emerge in public. It surfaced in private briefings, legal consultations, and conversations that were never meant to leave the room. And it led directly to the line Charles had avoided crossing his entire life. Because crossing it meant accepting a brutal reality. You cannot be both fully inside the monarchy and actively outside of it at the same time. At some point, the ambiguity becomes intolerable. This is where the public story diverges sharply from the internal one. The public saw a son speaking out. The palace saw a precedent being set. A precedent that said royal association could be selectively embraced or rejected depending on convenience. That precedent terrified institutional thinkers. Because once that door opens, it never closes again. If one prince can leverage royal status while rejecting royal responsibility, why not others in the future? Why not cousins? Why not grandchildren? Monarchies don't survive emotional reasoning. They survive structure. And structure was being tested. Inside the palace, a pattern had become impossible to ignore. Every attempt to de-escalate externally led to further escalation. Every silence was interpreted as guilt. Every concession became fuel. And with each cycle, the monarchy's authority eroded just a little more. Not enough to cause collapse. Enough to cause concern. Concern turned into calculation. Calculation turned into resolve. And resolve demanded a decision Charles had spent his entire adult life trying to avoid. He had to stop being the father who waits and start being the king who decides. This is where people misunderstood. Just a quiet tightening of parameters. Access reviewed. Privileges reassessed. Representation reconsidered. Each step defensible on its own. Devastating in combination. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. From the inside, everything was shifting. And once the internal consensus solidified, there was no incentive to reverse course. Because reversing course would mean admitting the line had been crossed too late. It would mean acknowledging that the monarchy had been reactive instead of decisive. Charles would not allow that. Not at this stage of his reign. Not with history watching. This is why the silence hardened. Why communication narrowed. Why decisions stopped including voices that once mattered. The line had been crossed. And once crossed, it could not be uncrossed. But here's the twist most people don't expect. Crossing that line wasn't the most consequential move. It simply made the next one possible. Because once the king accepted that emotional restraint was no longer the priority, he unlocked a pathway that had always existed, but had never been used. A pathway rooted not in sentiment, but in titles. And once the palace began seriously examining titles, everything escalated. Because titles are not just symbols, they are levers. And when a monarchy decides to pull them, it does so with intent. But the truly shocking part? The titles themselves were never the end goal. They were the mechanism. The real objective lay beneath them. Something far more powerful. Something far more final. And once that objective came into focus, the conversation inside the palace changed forever. Because they weren't just asking how to remove honor. They were asking how to remove influence. And that question leads directly to a truth most people still don't understand. Royal titles aren't granted for ceremony. They exist to extend power. And once power becomes a liability, it doesn't remain untouched. But what do titles really mean behind closed doors? Who controls them? And how far can a king actually go once he decides enough is enough? Because the answer to that explains why this situation is unlike anything we've seen before, and why the road ahead may already be closed, whether the public realizes it yet or not. What do royal titles actually do? Not what people think they do. Not the pageantry. Not the styling. Not the prefixes that look good on a wedding invitation. The real power of a royal title operates in spaces the public never sees. And once you understand that, the entire conversation shifts. Because the most dangerous misconception surrounding this story is the belief that stripping titles is symbolic, a gesture meant to humiliate or punish. That's not how the monarchy thinks. Titles are not decorations. They are infrastructure. They are legal and constitutional mechanisms that extend the authority, legitimacy, and reach of the crown beyond the sovereign himself. They determine who can speak on behalf of the institution, who receives protection, who carries implied credibility, and who is treated as an extension of royal power, even when they are physically distant. This is why the conversation inside the palace became so serious once titles entered the room. Because discussing titles isn't emotional. It's surgical. Here's the question the palace had to confront. What happens when a title holder consistently operates outside the boundaries of the institution, but still benefits from its authority? That question terrifies institutional thinkers. Because if the answer is nothing, the precedent is catastrophic. It tells future generations that royal status can be selectively embraced. That responsibility is optional. That loyalty is negotiable. Monarchies don't survive that logic. They survive clarity. And clarity demands consistency. Inside the palace, there was a growing recognition that the existing arrangement had created a loophole, one that allowed royal association without royal accountability. And once that loophole is acknowledged, it cannot be ignored. Let's break this down in practical terms. A royal title isn't just a name. It signals access. Access to diplomatic circles. Access to elite institutions. Access to credibility that cannot be earned elsewhere. Even when no official role is held, the title itself opens doors that remain closed to others. And when someone uses that access in ways the institution cannot control, the institution faces a dilemma. Do you absorb the risk or remove the access? This is where the public conversation often becomes simplistic. People ask, can a king even do that? The answer is complicated, and that complexity is exactly what makes titles such a powerful tool. Some titles are peerages. Some are princely styles. Some are tied to parliamentary mechanisms. Some are bound by tradition more than law. They are not all created equal. And that distinction matters enormously. Inside the palace, legal and constitutional advisors don't ask whether something will look harsh. They ask whether it's defensible, sustainable, and irreversible. Because once you touch titles, you are not sending a message. You are restructuring authority. This is why titles weren't discussed early on. They were the nuclear option. As long as the palace believed the situation could stabilize, titles remained untouched. They served as a bridge, a symbol of continued connection, however strained. But once the line was crossed, once restraint was deemed a liability, that bridge stopped being useful. It became dangerous. Because every day the titles remained intact, the contradiction deepened. Here's the irony most people miss. The more Prince Harry emphasized independence, the more problematic his retained titles became. Independence undermined the justification for continued status, and continued status undermined the credibility of independence. The contradiction couldn't coexist indefinitely. Something had to give. Inside the palace, the discussion shifted from should titles be removed to a far more revealing question. What do these titles still enable? That question reframes everything. Because the answer wasn't about pride or humiliation. It was about influence. Influence over narratives. Influence over perception. Influence over who gets listened to and who doesn't. Influence that the monarchy could no longer supervise. And unsupervised influence is intolerable to an institution built on control. This is where the conversation turned technical. Which titles are discretionary? Which privileges are attached by convention rather than statute? Which associations can be quietly redefined without public confrontation? The goal wasn't to shock the public. It was to close the loophole. And closing loopholes rarely requires spectacle. It requires precision. This is why people expecting a dramatic announcement misunderstand the strategy. A loud move invites backlash. A quiet one invites acceptance. Gradual changes allow the public to adjust without resistance. They normalize the outcome before anyone realizes it's complete. That's how institutions survive turbulence. By making endings feel inevitable. Let's talk about privileges for a moment. Because titles are only part of the equation, privileges are the shadow system. They include things like security assumptions, representational weight, implied authority in international spaces, and informal deference that follows a royal name wherever it goes. Privileges don't always appear on paper, but they are real, and they matter. When those privileges remain intact, the title continues to function, even if the role does not. This is why the palace began reassessing not just titles, but the ecosystem around them. What access still exists? What assumptions are still being made? What doors still open automatically? Once those questions were asked, the answers became uncomfortable, because the institution realized it was extending power without oversight. And power without oversight is a risk. This is where King Charles's long view becomes crucial. He is not governing for applause. He is governing for continuity. Every unresolved contradiction today becomes a crisis tomorrow. And the monarchy does not have the luxury of endless tomorrow. This is why the phrase stripping titles is misleading. The palace doesn't think in those terms. They think in terms of withdrawal of authority. Authority can be withdrawn in layers. First through silence, then through distance, then through access, then through legitimacy. Titles are simply the visible endpoint of a much longer process. And that process was already underway. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Removing a title doesn't erase a person. It redefines their relationship to power. That distinction matters. Because from the monarchy's perspective, this was never about exile. It was about alignment. And alignment had failed. Which brings us to the most important realization inside the palace. Once titles are examined as mechanisms rather than honors, the emotional debate ends. There is no question of fairness. Only function. Do these titles still serve the institution, or do they undermine it? Once that question is answered in the negative, the outcome becomes inevitable. Not immediate. Inevitable. This is why insiders began using a different language. Not removal. Reconfiguration. Not punishment. Clarification. Words matter in institutional decision-making. They signal intent. And the intent here was clear. To draw a line that could not be blurred again. to ensure that royal authority flowed in one direction, from the crown outward, not back through unofficial channels, to protect the future from ambiguity. And once that intent crystallized, the conversation moved forward quickly. Because when institutions stop debating whether something should happen and start planning how it will happen, momentum takes over. That's when resistance becomes irrelevant. But here's the twist that changes how this entire chapter should be understood. Titles were never the real prize. They were the lever used to address something far more consequential, something the public rarely discusses, something that goes beyond honor, beyond optics, beyond symbolism. Because beneath titles lies something even more powerful, something that determines who truly belongs and who does not, something that cannot be reclaimed once it's gone. And once the palace set its sights on that deeper objective, the path forward became brutally clear. Because removing a title sends a message, but removing influence reshapes history. And that was the move being prepared. The titles were just the beginning. What came next would redefine the entire relationship between Prince Harry and the crown. And once that next step was taken, there would be no going back. What is influence when no one officially acknowledges it? That's the question the palace finally confronted. And it's the question that pushed this situation past the point of symbolism and into something far more consequential. Because here's the reality most people never see. Influence doesn't disappear just because someone steps back from an official role. It doesn't vanish because a press release says, "No longer working royal." And it certainly doesn't evaporate because a person relocates across an ocean. Influence survives through perception, through assumptions, through doors that open without explanation, through the unspoken weight a name still carries in rooms where power circulates quietly. And that's exactly what began to worry the institution. Not the interviews, not the headlines, not even the criticism, the influence. Because influence is harder to track than authority, and far harder to control. This is the moment when the palace stopped asking how to manage appearances and started asking how to neutralize leverage. And that's when the conversation turned serious. Let's be clear about something uncomfortable. Royal influence doesn't require permission. It operates automatically. When someone introduces themselves with a royal title, the listener recalibrates. Expectations shift. Deference increases. Access expands. No policy memo needs to be issued. The system responds on its own. That's why influence is so dangerous when it's unsupervised. And from the palace's perspective, it had become exactly that. Unsupervised. Think about it this way. If someone speaks critically about the monarchy but is still treated as a credible extension of it, the institution loses control of its own narrative. It can't correct without validating. It can't ignore without appearing complicit. It becomes trapped. That trap was tightening. This is where the internal language shifted again. No longer about reconciliation. No longer about restraint. Now it was about containment. But containment doesn't mean silencing a person. It means limiting the reach of their words. And the most effective way to do that isn't confrontation. It's decoupling. Decoupling identity from authority. Decoupling name from power. Decoupling influence from institution. That's when the palace began mapping influence the way a strategist maps terrain. Where does it travel? Who amplifies it? Which assumptions sustain it? And the answer kept pointing back to one thing. Status. Status doesn't just command attention. It confers legitimacy. Even criticism sounds different when it comes from someone perceived as inside. And that perception lingered, which created an unacceptable risk. Because the monarchy cannot function if it no longer controls who is perceived as speaking from within. This is where people often misunderstand the stakes. They think this is about embarrassment. It's not. It's about authority. If the crown allows unofficial voices to carry official weight, it dilutes itself. And dilution is how institutions collapse slowly, without anyone noticing until it's too late. This is why the palace's next move wasn't public. It was structural. They began asking how influence could be quietly rerouted, how assumptions could be altered without spectacle, how legitimacy could be recentered where it belonged. This didn't require dramatic gestures. It required time, and patience, and consistency, which brings us to a subtle but crucial shift most people missed. The palace stopped reacting to statements and started redefining associations. Who appears alongside whom? Who is referenced in official contexts? Who is included in forward-looking narratives? Influence thrives on association. Remove the association, and influence begins to wither on its own. Not immediately, gradually. And that gradual erosion is far more effective than any public rebuke, because it changes how the world responds. Not overnight, but inevitably. There's another contradiction here that rarely gets discussed. Influence without responsibility is intoxicating. It allows someone to shape narratives without bearing consequences. But influence without institutional backing is also fragile. Once the source of legitimacy is questioned, the influence collapses inward. The palace understood this. They knew that if they could redefine the source of legitimacy, the influence would lose its foundation. This is where the future monarch entered the equation. Because influence isn't just about the present. It's about continuity. And continuity requires a clear center. That center was being consolidated around Prince William and the next generation. Not out of rivalry. Out of necessity. The monarchy needed a singular, uncontested focal point. Anything else invited confusion. Confusion invites instability. So the strategy became clear. Don't fight influence. Outgrow it. Shift the center so decisively that peripheral voices no longer matter. That takes time. And discipline. And a willingness to let noise burn itself out. Which is why the palace tolerated criticism longer than many expected. They weren't absorbing it out of weakness. They were waiting for the structure to change. Once the structure changed, the noise would lose resonance. And that's exactly what began to happen. Notice how coverage shifted. From central figure to side commentary. From primary source to secondary perspective. From insider voice to outside observer. These shifts didn't happen by accident. They happened because the palace stopped feeding the ecosystem that sustained influence. No briefings. No rebuttals. No engagement. And without engagement, influence starves. But here's where the situation crossed another threshold. Because influence isn't just external. It's internal too. Inside the family. Inside the institution. Inside the rooms where decisions are shaped before the world ever hears about them. And once influence is removed internally, external influence becomes irrelevant. That internal removal had already occurred. That's what the silence signaled. Which brings us to the most decisive realization of all. Once influence is gone, titles become hollow. They still exist on paper. But they no longer function. At that point, removing them isn't punitive. It's procedural. And that's why the palace could move forward without fear. Because the influence had already been neutralized. The rest was cleanup. This is why the public conversation often feels behind reality. People debate what might happen while the institution has already moved past the debate. They ask whether something will be done while the machinery is already in motion. They argue about fairness while the system focuses on function. And function always wins. But there's one more layer to this. One that changes how the entire strategy should be understood. Influence doesn't just affect narratives. It affects access. Access to decision-makers. Access to platforms. Access to moments that shape history. And once access is quietly withdrawn, influence cannot regenerate. No matter how loud the voice. No matter how compelling the story. This is why the palace didn't need to rush. They knew the moment influence was decoupled, the outcome was locked in. The public would eventually catch up. It always does. But by the time it does, the path back is gone. And that's the most chilling part of this chapter. Because the palace didn't just remove influence. It redefined belonging. Belonging is the most powerful currency in any institution. And once it's withdrawn, everything else becomes irrelevant. Titles, privileges, visibility. All of it flows from belonging. Remove that, and nothing else holds. Which means the real decision wasn't about titles at all. It was about who truly belonged to the future of the monarchy. And once that decision was made, everything else followed naturally. Quietly. Inevitably. But here's the question that changes everything. If influence was already gone, if belonging had already been redefined, why did the palace still need to touch the titles? Why not simply let them fade into irrelevance? Because there was one final risk that silence and decoupling couldn't address. A risk that demanded a formal response. A risk rooted not in narrative, but in law. And once legal considerations entered the picture, discretion was no longer enough. Something had to be clarified on paper. And when institutions move from unwritten rules to written ones, the consequences become permanent. That's when the quiet strategy met its final test. And what happened next would transform a gradual withdrawal into an unmistakable end. What happens when silence is no longer enough? Because this is where the story takes a sharp turn, away from perception, away from. Because the monarchy had crossed a psychological threshold. They no longer believed the situation would self-correct. They no longer believed silence would resolve it. They no longer believed time was an ally. Time had become a liability. Every year that passed without clarification increased exposure. Every delay increased risk. So the machinery turned. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly. This is where the myth of a sudden stripping collapses. There is no switch you flip. There is a process. And that process had already begun. Legal teams don't announce themselves. They prepare. They examine what is discretionary versus fixed. What can be modified versus what requires parliamentary involvement. What can be reframed without backlash versus what must be justified explicitly. And in doing so, they change the future, often without the present noticing. This is why people waiting for a dramatic declaration misunderstand the moment. By the time something is announced, the real decisions are already months old. The announcement is just the echo. Another crucial realization emerged during this phase. Titles do not just affect the person who holds them. They affect the institution that grants them. If a title becomes associated with instability, controversy, or contradiction, it damages the credibility of the granting authority. That's a risk no monarchy can tolerate indefinitely. And here's the part that makes this so uncomfortable. The palace didn't need to prove wrongdoing. They didn't need to assign blame. They didn't need to win a public argument. They only needed to decide that continued ambiguity posed unacceptable risk. That's it. Once that conclusion was reached, everything else became procedural. This is why legal clarification is so powerful. It doesn't accuse. It defines. And definitions outlast opinions. Inside the palace, the language changed again. Not should we respond, but how do we formalize separation? Formalization is the death knell of informal arrangements. It removes flexibility. It removes hope. It removes the illusion that everything can return to how it was. And formalization was now on the table. This is where the emotional stakes spike. Because for Prince Harry, the informal gray zone had always offered something precious. Possibility. Possibility of reconciliation. Possibility of return. Possibility that time would soften positions. Formalization destroys possibility. Once something is defined legally, it cannot be undefined without deliberate reversal. And institutions hate reversal. Reversal implies error. Reversal invites scrutiny. Reversal undermines authority. So they avoid it at all costs. Which means when they formalize, they commit. This is why the palace moved carefully but decisively. They weren't trying to shock. They were trying to lock the door. And locking the door legally doesn't require theatrics. It requires clarity. That clarity took the form of quiet alignment across departments. Legal, communications, protocol. Everyone needed to be on the same page, literally. Because once the record changes, everyone must act accordingly. That alignment didn't happen overnight. But once it was achieved, momentum became unstoppable. Here's the chilling part. At this stage, the palace no longer needed to consider feelings at all. The decision had transcended personal relationships. It had become institutional self-preservation. And self-preservation always outranks sentiment. This is why attempts to frame this as cruelty miss the point. Cruelty implies intent to harm. This was intent to protect. Protect the crown. Protect its clarity. Protect its future. And once protection becomes the objective, compromise disappears. This also explains why the palace didn't seek negotiation. Negotiation implies shared authority. And that was precisely what they were eliminating. The monarchy cannot negotiate its own definition. It must assert it. Which brings us to the most sobering realization of this chapter. Once legal clarification is pursued, the outcome is not about punishment. It's about permanence. Permanence of boundaries. Permanence of roles. Permanence of separation. And permanence is something no apology can undo. This is why the palace acted when it did. Not in the heat of controversy, but in the calm after influence had already faded. That's when legal action is safest. That's when resistance is lowest. That's when the public is distracted enough not to notice until it's too late. And by the time it notices, the record has already been set. Which raises the most painful question yet. Did Prince Harry realize the shift from informal to formal had begun? Or did he still believe this was a phase, another cycle that would eventually reset? Because those two interpretations lead to very different outcomes. If he recognized the shift, then every move afterward took on existential weight. If he didn't, then he may have continued operating under assumptions that no longer applied. And institutions do not correct assumptions once formalization begins. They let reality deliver the lesson. That's what makes this phase so final. Not because of what was said, but because of what was written. Once something is written into the institutional framework, it stops being a family matter. It becomes history, and history doesn't negotiate. But here's the twist that changes how this entire legal phase should be understood. Legal clarification wasn't the endgame. It was the safeguard. The real objective lay elsewhere, beyond law, beyond titles, beyond privileges. Something more symbolic, more visible, something the public would eventually notice and understand. Without needing explanation. Because while law locks doors quietly, symbolism tells the world they were locked for a reason. And once symbolism enters the picture, silence is no longer sufficient. That's when the monarchy prepares for the moment the public finally connects the dots. And that moment was coming. Fast. What does a monarchy do when it needs the world to understand something without ever explaining it? Because this is where everything shifts from quiet mechanics to unmistakable signal. Up until now, the strategy lived in shadows. Silence, distance, legal clarification. All effective, all discreet. But discretion has a limit. At some point, an institution built on symbolism must speak its native language. Not words, symbols. And that moment was approaching fast. Here's the thing most people misunderstand about the monarchy. It doesn't communicate primarily through statements. It communicates through visibility. Who appears? Who doesn't? Who stands where? Who is named? And who is conspicuously absent? Symbolism is not decoration in a monarchy. It is governance. And once the legal framework had been stabilized, the palace could finally move to the phase that would make the separation undeniable to the public, without ever needing to announce it. This is where silence gives way to symbolism. And symbolism is far louder. Ask yourself a simple question. When was the last time Prince Harry was positioned in a way that suggested future relevance? Not nostalgia, not legacy, future. When was the last time his presence felt directional rather than historical? That distinction matters more than people realize. The monarchy does not signal endings with words. It signals them by redirecting attention. And that redirection had already begun. The center of gravity shifted decisively. Not away from Harry alone, but toward a future that no longer accounted for him. This is where the role of the heir became unavoidable. Because symbolism requires a focal point. And that focal point was now firmly Prince William. Not as a rival, not as an antagonist, but as inevitability. The institution needed to make something clear without saying it. This is the future. This is the continuity. This is where authority resides now, and will reside next. Once that message is sent consistently, everything else becomes background noise. And consistency is the key. Symbolism only works when it repeats. Once is coincidence. Twice is curiosity. 3 times is policy. And suddenly, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Who was being centered in ceremonial moments? Who was being positioned as the voice of continuity? Who was being framed as stability itself? And equally important, who was not? Absence is the most powerful symbol of all. Because absence invites interpretation, and the palace understands this instinctively. They know the public will fill silence with meaning. They know journalists will connect dots without needing guidance. They know history will read patterns even when no one explains them. So the palace did not rush. It let symbolism accumulate. Slowly, deliberately, irreversibly. Each appearance reinforced the same message. The future is settled, and the past is being archived. This is where many people feel a sudden emotional shift without fully understanding why. They describe it as something feeling different, colder, more final, less dramatic, but heavier. That's the effect of symbolic closure. It doesn't provoke outrage. It produces acceptance. Acceptance that something has already happened. This is why the monarchy prefers symbolism to statements. Statements can be argued with. Symbols cannot. You can disagree with a press release. You cannot argue with absence. and absence had become unmistakable, not just in public ceremonies, but in planning language, forward-facing narratives, institutional storytelling. When the monarchy speaks about its future, certain names appear naturally, others don't. And once a name stops appearing in future-oriented contexts, its relevance collapses quietly. That's not cruelty. That's transition. Here's the contradiction that makes this so emotionally complex. Symbolic removal hurts more than official punishment. Because punishment acknowledges importance, removal denies it, and denial is far harder to reconcile with. For Prince Harry, this stage would have felt different from everything before. Not confrontational, not reactive, just distant, as if the institution was no longer responding to him at all. Because it wasn't. It was responding to time. And time, once claimed by an institution, moves forward without apology. This is why symbolic moves matter so much more than legal ones in the public mind. Most people don't understand legal nuance, but they understand absence. They understand when someone is no longer part of the picture. And once the picture is redrawn enough times, the old version fades from memory. That's how history is edited. Not rewritten, reframed. The palace knows this better than anyone. They know that future documentaries, textbooks, and retrospectives will rely on visuals. Who stood where? Who was present at defining moments? Who embodied continuity? And those visuals were being curated carefully now. Which brings us to an uncomfortable realization. This wasn't about erasing Prince Harry from history. It was about closing his chapter. And closing chapters is essential for institutions that must keep moving forward. But here's where the strategy becomes almost ruthless in its elegance. The palace didn't need to exclude him actively. It simply stopped including him. That's all. No announcement. No justification. No public debate. Just a new normal. And once a new normal is established, the old one becomes impossible to reclaim. Because reclaiming it would require disruption. And disruption is the one thing the monarchy cannot afford. This is why reconciliation became increasingly unlikely at this stage. Not because emotions were too raw, but because the system had already adjusted. Reintroducing someone once symbolic separation has occurred creates confusion. It raises questions. It destabilizes narratives. Institutions avoid that at all costs. This is why symbolic closure often precedes formal confirmation. The public adjusts first. Then the paperwork follows. Not the other way around. Which is why so many people feel like they're only now realizing what's been happening for months. The process wasn't hidden. It was subtle. And subtlety is the monarchy's greatest weapon. But there's another layer to symbolism that makes this moment particularly final. Symbolism doesn't just speak to the public. It speaks to insiders, courtiers, advisors, foreign dignitaries, institutional partners. When they see who is consistently centered, they adjust their own behavior. They stop asking about those who are no longer visible. They stop planning around them. They stop considering them relevant. And once that internal shift happens, external perception follows inevitably. This is why symbolic moves are so powerful. They don't require enforcement. They self-perpetuate, which means by the time the public fully notices, the outcome is already locked in. Now ask yourself this. If symbolism has already communicated separation, if legal structures have already clarified boundaries, if influence has already been neutralized, what's left? Why would the monarchy still need to take another step? Why not let the symbolic ending stand on its own? Because there was one remaining vulnerability. One thing symbolism could not fully resolve. Expectation. As long as certain titles and styles remained formally intact, expectation lingered. Expectation of eventual return. Expectation of reconciliation. Expectation of relevance. Symbolism weakens expectation, but it doesn't eliminate it completely. And expectation is dangerous. Because expectation invites pressure. Pressure invites debate. Debate invites instability. Which means expectation had to be addressed directly. Not emotionally. Not symbolically. But definitively. And that's when everything converged. The legal groundwork. The symbolic messaging. The institutional alignment. All pointed toward the same conclusion. The final step wasn't about sending a message. It was about ending the waiting. Ending the speculation. Ending the assumption that this was temporary. Because as long as people believe something is temporary, they resist accepting it. The monarchy needed acceptance. And acceptance only comes when ambiguity disappears. which means the next move would not be subtle. It would not be loud either. It would be unmistakable, a move that required no explanation because its meaning would be self-evident. And once that move was made, there would be no credible argument that this was still a phase. No plausible claim that everything could return to how it was. The road would be closed. Formally, publicly, permanently. But here's the final twist. That move was not designed to punish Prince Harry. It was designed to free the monarchy, free it from contradiction, free it from ambiguity, free it from a narrative it could no longer sustain. And once that freedom was achieved, the institution could finally move forward without looking back. Which brings us to the moment the public has been waiting for, even if it doesn't realize it yet. The moment where symbolism and law converge. The moment where silence ends not with an explanation, but with an outcome. Because once titles and privileges are addressed in unison, expectation collapses. And when expectation collapses, acceptance follows. But how exactly does the monarchy execute that final step? Who has the authority to initiate it? And why does timing matter more than justification? Because the answers to those questions explain why this isn't just another royal dispute. It's the end of a road. And once you see how that end is constructed, you'll understand why there is no turning back. Who actually has the power to close the door? Because this is where speculation meets structure, and where fantasy about royal authority collides with reality. Most people imagine the monarch as an absolute figure, able to erase titles and privileges with a single stroke of a pen. That image is emotionally satisfying, dramatic, and completely misleading. The modern monarchy doesn't work that way. Power today is layered, shared, procedural, and that complexity is precisely why this final step mattered so much. Because when an institution chooses to act within constraints rather than outside them, the outcome becomes far harder to challenge. This wasn't about a king acting alone. It was about alignment. Alignment between the crown, the state, and the future. And that alignment had to be airtight. Here's the first uncomfortable truth. A monarch can signal intent. But permanence requires process. And process requires legitimacy beyond the throne. That's why timing became everything. Why this didn't happen in the heat of controversy. Why it didn't happen immediately after public clashes. Why it waited until influence faded, symbolism settled, and legal groundwork hardened. Because only then could the final step be framed not as retaliation, but as resolution. Inside the palace, the question wasn't can we. It was will this stand? Stand up to scrutiny. Stand up to precedent. Stand up to history. Because once a line like this is crossed formally, it becomes a reference point for generations. The monarchy doesn't just act for today. It acts so that future kings and queens don't have to revisit the same problem. That's the mindset shaping this moment. Which brings us to the role of the state. This is where the conversation stops being emotional altogether. Because the monarchy may be symbolic, but the state is structural. And when the two move in coordination, the result is immovable. Any action that touches titles, styles, or formal privileges cannot exist in a vacuum. It must exist within a legal ecosystem, one that includes advisory mechanisms, constitutional norms, and in some cases, legislative awareness. Not because the palace wants permission, but because legitimacy matters. Legitimacy is what turns a decision into history rather than controversy. And legitimacy is what prevents reversal. This is why no rushed announcement was ever likely. The palace needed a moment when the action would feel less like a response and more like an inevitability. When public fatigue had already set in, when narratives had stabilized, when resistance had softened into resignation. Only then does a decisive act land cleanly. Ask yourself this. If such a move had happened at the height of media chaos, what would it have looked like? Petty, reactionary, cruel. But after months, even years, of gradual separation, it looks like closure. That distinction is everything. And that's why authority mattered less than timing. Because timing reframes motive. And motive determines legacy. This is where the crown's coordination with broader constitutional norms becomes critical. The monarchy does not need to explain itself when it acts within established frameworks. It lets the framework speak for it. That's why any final step would be structured to appear procedural rather than personal. No blame, no accusation, no emotional language. Just definition. Definition of roles. Definition of boundaries. Definition of what belongs to the institution and what does not. Definitions don't invite debate. They end it. This is why speculation about dramatic confrontations misses the point. There was no confrontation left to have. The confrontation phase was over long ago. What remained was alignment. Alignment between the monarchy's internal reality and its external structure. And once alignment is achieved, the move becomes almost boring. Boring is good. Boring is stable. Boring is irreversible.